Hi, I'm Molly Ball of Time Magazine. I'm here with my colleague, Vera Bergengruen. Welcome, Vera.
Thank you.
So we're here to talk about your new profile of Bobby Kennedy Jr. Now, you normally cover disinformation, far-right online communities. How did that lead you to a profile of Bobby Kennedy?
Yeah, so I'm usually kind of an investigative correspondent. I cover a lot of online movements, where these kind of ideas come from that seem to mobilize large groups of people, especially on the internet. And I was covering a lot the anti-vaccine movement during COVID, how that was taking off, and who the big personalities were whose name kind of became synonymous with the movement. And one of them was RFK Jr., and people really responded to him, partly maybe because he's a Kennedy, they recognize his name, but he had been running an anti-vaccine organization for decades before it became, trendy, as people kind of said during COVID, before it became much more of a mainstream idea. And so I actually went to a big rally on the Lincoln Memorial. It was called Defeat the Mandates. It was last January in 2022. And he was one of the keynote speakers. It was a very right-wing rally. It was everyone was holding all these signs that had a range of very right-wing slogans. The Proud Boys were there, and he is, he's a Democrat, and he was there as one of the main speakers. And a lot of people really responded to him, to his message about, the dangers of vaccines. What he said was a big cover-up by the government. And, all of them were Republicans. All of them were very conservative. And they told me that they really admired him and were going to keep following, his career and see what he did next. And so I also kept covering what he did next. And now, he's running as a Democrat, but seems to have a very odd coalition of support from the far left, the far right, and kind of everything in between.
Right. So he's now running for president in the Democratic primary against President Joe Biden. But it's a very unconventional campaign. Talk about the time you spent with him, the reporting that you did.
Yeah, so he actually lives in LA. He's married to Cheryl Hines, who's a famous actress from Curb Your Enthusiasm. And, he lives in a very kind of unusual world, usually for someone who wants to go enter politics in that particular route. And I went to his house. He lives, up, 1,000 feet above sea level. You lose reception when you drive up to his house in Mandeville Canyon. And, his entire home, his living room, it's a shrine to his famous uncle, famous father. He has, a bust of, JFK. He's got all these framed memorabilia from his dad. He was 9 when his uncle was assassinated and 14 when his dad was shot. And so it's almost, he's created this, time has kind of stopped at that moment. They were both so young when they were killed. And so they have all these campaign posters. RFK Jr. himself is 69. And so, it's almost like that's frozen in time as these very young, charismatic politicians were cut down in their prime. And he says he's trying to continue on their legacy. And you can tell by being in his home that, he's kind of spent his whole life in that shadow and thinking about that legacy.
Wow. What's he like? What's his personality?
He's a really interesting guy. You can tell that he has the demeanor of someone who's used to being listened to. He was born a Kennedy. He was always, he had a very political, obviously famous political family. And it's almost like he's used to being listened to on any topic, whether it's cryptocurrency or Ukraine. He studies it, and then, he goes out and talks about what he's learned, and he's used to people taking him seriously. And so he's, it's odd in some ways because you look at him and he bears a striking resemblance to his dad. Everyone always said that he was the one that was the most similar and the one that most kind of had his political talents. But he has a vocal disorder. He lost his voice when he was 42. He says it's a side effect of a vaccine. There's no proof of that. But it's almost like you're looking at his dad or at his uncle, at someone who looks pretty familiar, but, he got old and they never did. And so he kind of has this, again, this very kind of 60s look, a very similar way of expressing himself. But then when you listen to what he's actually saying, he's someone who clearly spends a lot of time online. He speaks kind of in the parlance of someone who's, spends a lot of time on Twitter Spaces and talks a lot on kind of right-wing Telegram groups. And so it's a really odd combination of that kind of 60s nostalgic style. He wears the skinny ties that were popular in the 60s, just like his uncle and his dad. He always has his sleeves rolled up. There's a certain look that, whether consciously or unconsciously, he's trying to emulate. And at the same time, he's probably the most online candidate. He's got a TikTok. He's out there talking about censorship and all those kind of things. And so it was a very interesting conversation to listen to someone who, again, seems stuck in such different kind of spheres.
Yeah, when you talk about him sort of going on and on and on at length, to your point, but you describe his appeal as being a sort of MAGA for Democrats. It seems like it's a nostalgia that goes beyond just the Kennedy family, right? It's an older America that he's trying to invoke.
Yeah, it really struck me from his work throughout his life in different ways. He keeps referring back to and even before he was even alive. I mean, he's kind of talking about people used to be able to go out when they lost their job and catch fish in the river and feed their families, and now the rivers are polluted. And so what I'm trying to say is it goes all the way back. He really kind of has this very nostalgic vision of America, but especially kind of from what he considers the golden era of the 60s, which again, his life was kind of divided into before and after his father was assassinated. And it cut short this campaign that was so much about optimism, about forward-looking. Bobby Kennedy's campaign was just all about the future and about this particular vision for America. And he sees himself as the heir of that, but really all he talks about is the past. He kind of talks about, the companies didn't used to be able to poison medicines without anyone holding them accountable. The government, people used to trust the government and, trust the government not to lie to them or censor them, which, if you know the 60s, I don't think is quite accurate. But he speaks about this era and clearly wants to return to it. And so I specifically just asked him, I said, it actually strikes me pretty MAGA-y, pretty Trumpian. And he said, I want to go back to the America of my youth. And he wants to, when you go to his campaign rallies, the signs are, I'm a Kennedy Democrat, and then the same font and the same blue block letters from the 60s. And even though I think most people now, most voters are younger than him, but it still kind of seems to bring up something in most Democrats. Again, this era that's clearly been kind of idealized, but they, it sounds pretty good to people to say, sure, we want to go back to that. We're dissatisfied with the current political sphere. We're okay with Biden. We don't really like him all that much, and we'd love to go back to what you're describing.
Well, and people probably know the famous name. They may know his anti-vaccine activism, but talk a little bit about his career before that.
Yeah, so he got really into environmental law when he was younger. He spent 3 decades, becoming a very famous environmental lawyer. He got all kinds of awards, accolades, and he was extremely respected in that field. He was, he's pretty intense and obsessive about his passions. Everyone says that. You can tell no matter what he focuses on, he kind of tends to be that way. And so he just, relentlessly pursued polluters. He was credited with cleaning up the Hudson, kind of suing all these companies, coal, oil, and focusing a lot on indigenous communities. He traveled a lot to South America, and again, like that's what many people do remember. I think he was on magazine covers as the Kennedy who matters, the one who's going to be the one who has the political future. And then in the 2000s, and it's important to realize that this is a continuation of his worldview. It's not, a lot of people have been asking recently, since it's become so prominent, what happened to RFK Jr.? When did he go off the deep end? But it's important to understand that for him, he was pursuing polluters, and then he decided that vaccines were polluted with mercury. None of this has a scientific basis. Scientists and experts dispute this, and they say it's not true. But he basically decided that vaccines were being polluted. That he says that when he was younger, there was no autism. There weren't as many peanut allergies. He basically pulls all these facts together, which experts say he takes out of context, and basically decided that kind of with the same idea of going backwards, the thing that had changed were vaccines, and that vaccines are dangerous for children. And again, there's no factual basis to this, but he founded, with that same obsessive energy, basically builds the largest anti-vaccine organization in the United States. And the Kennedy name kind of helped with that, because if you come out of nowhere and start saying these things, you might not get very far. But he used his family name to kind of give some respectability to very fringe anti-vaccine views, which remained fringe until recently, until the pandemic.
Yeah, as you said, the COVID sort of brought a lot of these probably important to emphasize, very dangerous, unscientific, non-factual ideas about vaccines into the mainstream, very dangerous ideas. But he's had this appetite for conspiracy theories for a long time, in addition to the vaccine stuff, even stuff about his dad, right?
Right, and he seemed to be a bit more low-key about that back when he was, again, he was constantly asked to go on TV interviews to talk about his family, to talk about his environmental work. And once he really veered hard into these, dangerous conspiracy theories about vaccines, he was kind of ostracized. He wasn't allowed to go on the documentaries about his dad. People basically didn't want to interview him about anything. And so he started going further and further into other conspiracies, which he may have kind of believed before, but clearly now felt he might as well go into them. So he had a very extensive theory about the 2004 election being stolen. He thinks the CIA killed his dad. And then it just kind of goes on. He thinks 5G is being installed in order to harvest our all kinds of different information about us. And all these things he usually positions in a way that many people would kind of agree with. And then he kind of goes way, way further. And it's a specific tactic that is pretty effective to get people to believe these conspiracies.
Does he have a governing philosophy beyond this sort of idea that there's a conspiracy out there? Does he have a set of political beliefs that you could imagine, being president and working from that?
Right. I mean, his main idea, and he hasn't set out very detailed policy proposals or anything like that for most areas. His main idea is that, there's this corporate control of government, of every agency, and he needs to root that out. He needs to get rid of all those financial conflicts of interest, all those entanglements, and basically return the government to the people. And his tagline for his campaign is "Reclaim Democracy," which is pretty stark in that particular way too. And again, I asked him, how would you do that? How that seems, it sounds. I think few people would disagree that rooting out any corruption, all these things he says on their face sound good to most people. He said it would be very easy. He was fully confident. He said, he says he sued so many of these agencies that he knows exactly who's a good person and a bad person, and he'll be able to basically get rid of them. And I just kind of started giving him some agencies. I said, what about the FDA? He's like, oh yeah, that guy's a bad guy. I'm going to put in the people I used to work with when I was a lawyer. And then I asked him about the CIA, and he said most people were, dutiful civil servants, just trying to do their best. But again, you need to kind of get rid of the top people who are, in his mind, kind of completely controlled by all these corrupt corporations that are pulling the strings. And that's just his main message, is basically get me in there and I will kind of go back to this particular version of things. He doesn't have, from what our discussions, a particular immigration policy. He doesn't have comprehensive policies for healthcare. Maybe, it's obviously early days, but the two main things are ending the kind of corporate control, what he says the corporate control of American government, and also ending endless wars. He says he's going to stop support for Ukraine and kind of get America out of this cycle of being involved abroad.
And one of the most interesting things I thought about your story was this very unconventional set of fans that he's attracted. He obviously runs in some very elite circles, but his campaign now is attracting support from everyone from Aaron Rodgers, the quarterback, to Jack Dorsey, the Twitter founder, Alicia Silverstone, other Hollywood figures. Right. So talk a little bit about the sort of very unconventional campaign he's running.
Yeah, it's very odd. The kind of people he's attracting have pretty big megaphones. They're very well-known people, some of them. Again, I think a lot of them are kind of drawn. They're not excited about Joe Biden. And it's not that they're necessarily behind everything RFK Jr. is selling, because it's still unclear, like we said, what exactly he's selling for the most part. But they like having an alternative, and what they're mainly drawn to, I think, is being able to discuss these pet issues, which a lot of them have as well. Alicia Silverstone, the actress, was very involved with this anti-vaccine organization, which is called the Children's Health Defense Fund. So it's all around the idea of children and kind of saving the children, I guess. Other people like what he says about censorship. This has been a very long ongoing debate, especially in the last couple of years, about people being canceled, about people who, who decides what is misinformation, why can people be on Twitter. This is the kind of free speech absolutists, Elon Musk style people. He basically just, because of his name and because of the way he is, he's basically giving all these people a platform in order to discuss these ideas in a way that you would never have with even Trump, with anyone who's kind of in the current political mainstream. And so people, Musk wants to have him on. He had a 2-hour conversation where RFK Jr. mainly interviewed Musk. He said, "What do you think?" And so Musk was thrilled to tell him what he thought. And so I think that's the reason he's attracting this very unlikely coalition. Is less because most people don't want to necessarily hear what RFK Jr. thinks in terms of fixing the country, but he's presenting an opportunity to have these conversations.
Interesting. So, as you report, even most members of his family don't support what he's doing. They've written op-eds saying, he's sort of abusing the Kennedy name, but he does seem to be getting traction. There's consistently now in a lot of these early polls of the Democratic primary, he's in solid double digits, as high as 20%. Should we be taking him seriously as a candidate? Could he win?
Well, that's a good question. I think again, there aren't many people challenging Joe Biden. So I think in terms of polls, he has a lot of name recognition. Again, he's a Kennedy. People, you talk to pollsters and they say, okay, a lot of people are just saying, yes, I would support him because they aren't excited about Biden and the Kennedy name means something. But he is attracting, I was skeptical, but he is attracting an interesting amount of support. I've spoken to a lot of people who either didn't vote in the last election or, just kind of seem for different reasons motivated about this guy. And he is running what he calls kind of he's going on a lot of podcasts. He's kind of attracting these really, he's getting a lot of oxygen from a lot of new mediums, not that new, but that aren't really used as much in campaigning. And so a lot of people are basically listening to him. He's recently gone on Joe Rogan. 11 million people listen to every episode. That's an average. And so that's a lot of people for someone like him who 4 years ago was completely on the fringes and nobody would really have on their platform, just to talk about some pretty dangerous conspiracy theories that, the doctors and experts say, this is going to get people killed. And he says, he told me straight up, he said, running for president makes it harder for me to be censored. And so he's kind of doing this to an extent to be listened to. And when you talk to him, you really get the sense that he was very upset and very hurt by by his family members, by the political establishment, by everyone turning their backs on someone they used to call during campaign season to endorse them, And so he feels like he's in his element, he's doing what he's meant to be doing. And so just by going out there and constantly not refusing a single interview, going on every podcast, I don't think he can win, but I think he's exposing, his real goal seems to be to also just expose the more people that he can to these ideas.
It sounds like it's almost a form of vindication for him.
Kind of felt that way, yeah.
Well, you write at the end of your piece that his candidacy may say more about America in 2023 than about him specifically. What to you is the larger phenomenon that he represents?
I think he's giving, this is it started before COVID, but it really became really apparent to most people during COVID. These conversations that people wanted to have, this kind of bottomless appetite to discuss, we can call it conspiracy theories, we can call it disinformation, but really wanting to be out there challenging the kind of what they would call the mainstream narrative about whether it's COVID, whether it's about Ukraine. There's a lot of kind of anti-establishment, contrarian people who have pretty big platforms, who are pretty well off, and they want to be having these conversations in a political context. And he's basically giving them the excuse to do that. And so I think people love discussing this kind of stuff. People have a lot of the pandemic, the disruption of it, and just the amount of confusion that there was with the health maintenance, with everything else. People had a lot of legitimate questions about that. It also gave an opening for a lot of conspiracy theories, a deepened distrust of government agencies, of the government telling you what to do. The vaccine mandates kind of only expanded that. And he used that to his advantage because he's basically, he and many other people want to keep relitigating what happened during COVID. And with everything, with the 2020 election, January 6th, so many very big disruptive moments happened. And these people want to keep discussing it. And kind of what they want to say is, we were right. So he's kind of, he's like, we were right about this. They said that you should wear a mask, and then they said this, and then they say that. And some people want to keep discussing it. A lot of people who really fell into those things, lost family members over it, lost jobs over it. They were ostracized by people, and now he's giving them a chance to kind of, again, be kind of vindicated and to have a very high platform discussion of these things, which a year ago probably wouldn't be getting this much oxygen, if that makes sense.
Right. Such a fascinating piece. Vera, thank you so much.
Thanks, Molly.